Phyllis, Barney, May 8th, 2000. You know, we're taping. You know that, right?
I
Gotcha.
know that.
Okay. Go ahead. Jim Hirsch is frustrated with.
Well, it's just this view which I see also, and I get frustrated with that folkies tend to be too self-deprecating, and they sell themselves in the genre short. I mean, there is not, maybe occasionally in jazz, but there's not another place where, you know, after the performer is tuning on stage, the first thing he says is, well, close enough for folk music. You know, as if being out of tune is something that is acceptable, because, I mean, it denigrates the professional level of the field and the music, and it lowers audience expectations, and that's just one little bit of what happens all the time. You know, if you look at small folk societies, which is the background that I had when I first got involved in Folk Alliance when it started, was in very small towns and small folk societies, and I can't tell you the arguments and the long, heartfelt sessions that went on over raising ticket prices from $2 to $3, you know, for performers, or to get enough money at the door to be able to afford some better performers. And it's, you know, the difference of $1, you know, is something that folkies hold very close and very dear. And I know where Jim comes from is the idea, if you don't put value on it, nobody else is going to put value on it. And you can't, you know, his continual frustration is the undervaluing of the field. And that's something that Folk Alliance was formed to combat, if you will. You know, I don't know if combat is the best word, but to sort of try to raise our own expectations, as well as try to put it out there, put folk music out there on a level playing field with some of the other genres of music.
Now, you came, I remember reading the minutes of the Malibu get-together in 89, I guess January 89, and it described you as running an electronic BBS.
Right.
Someone who went on email about 2 years ago. What is it? What's an electronic BBS?
Bulletin board service.
Was this something that existed in the 80s that bypassed me as I was working as a professional?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. It was the early internet stuff, and it also was pre-CompuServe.
Okay.
But there were other services. There was a service called The Source. There were a couple other ones. There was one for Commodore users. Remember the Commodore 64 is really early.
No, I don't.
Computer. See, you're such a young thing. But Commie 64s was, I mean, you know, we're talking ancient machines here. But long about 1986 or 87, I was living in another one of these small towns, and
You were in the Northwest, is that?
at that time I was in northeastern Colorado.
Okay, that's right.
I had a whole different day job. I worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service,
Okay.
and so I was out on the Eastern Plains, and I went back to graduate school, and I got a computer, and I got involved in you know, a lot of computing around scientific stuff, and then for fun I signed on to one of these services, and I found, you know, this whole community of people who were sort of the early networkers in that kind of thing. And
Were they united by a community of interest? Were there like chat rooms or interest groups? It was just people who, the commonality was that they were on the computer.
Yeah, and essentially at that time that was enough.
Okay.
You know, but within that there developed subgroups, and in fact what I did do was a bulletin board that was national, that listed folk performances around the country. And, you know, people would send me their stuff. I'd glean stuff from, you know, eventually Dirty Linen was sending me their listing that I would post online, and they would get stuff from me, and, you know, we'd go back and forth. But yeah, it was, I started as most of us start these things for my own interest, because I traveled a lot with my job, and I wanted to be able to find good concerts in the places that I was going. But, you know, we did things like, we posted lyrics to songs, but of course that ended up in all those copyright and all that kind of stuff. But so we had all these rules about, you know, it had to be trad, or it had to be, you had to have permission of the author to post and that kind of thing. So I spent a lot of time talking. And so yeah, that's how I was invited to Malibu, was because I was doing that.
Okay, and I guess Clark was an early internet user, is that correct?
Right.
Somebody even told me he was an early internet developer, but I don't know.
Yeah, he was.
Was he really?
With Spry computers, and yeah.
Okay.
He was, and I actually called right ahead of the meeting, because I called Elaine Weissman and I said, maybe I shouldn't come to this meeting. I mean, it sounds like, he says, oh no, you have to come. What you're doing is really important and we don't know how it's going to fit in, but it's got to fit in somewhere. So I went, and I think Clark knew what a computer was. I'm not entirely sure anyone else did. By the conference in Philadelphia, which was the second one, the one where actually the bylaws were voted in, I gave a computer workshop, and there were 8 people there, one of whom was Clark. One other person had a computer, and nobody else did. And that's 1990. So when you think about how much the internet has done for independent music since then, it's absolutely amazing.
What was your as a folkie? Were you just a fan, or were you involved in
I was a presenter. Yeah,
okay.
Small organizations.
In Colorado.
Yeah, and then I moved to Wisconsin, and then I moved to the Northwest. So 3 years in Wisconsin, I spent working on festivals and small concert series.
As a profession?
No, not as a profession.
Okay, this is all avocation.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And the same in Colorado. I was still with Fish and Wildlife. I mean, in the Northwest, I was still Fish and Wildlife Service, but I was a concert promoter, and I worked through the small organizations that were in my area there.
I see.
So always as a presenter.
And when you say presenter, are you talking about house concert size, small unit, the church-based thing, or what type of level?
Well, the festivals were usually pretty large. They weren't big festivals. They were, 3,000 to 5,000 people coming in. Right. But there were, but a lot of house concerts, small community center-based concerts.
Okay. Let me jump ahead a little bit. I'd like. Well, as you've been enmeshed in this and your ED and all that. When people ask you, okay, you work for the Folk Alliance, you're the head of the Folk Alliance, the director of the Folk Alliance. What is that? What do you tell them?
What I tell them is that it's an umbrella service organization for people who are involved in folk music and dance, as artists, presenters, agents, record companies, everybody who makes the folk music business tick. And it's not necessarily people who do it for a salary, but it is people who do it at a professional level, whether a volunteer or paid.
Okay, so I'll make an assumption that appeases 90% of the people you talk to or more, and then some will say, "What kind of music is that?"
Yeah, exactly. Then the other 10% say, "Well, what is folk music?" And to which I say, "Well, Folk Alliance actually, by policy, the board does not define folk music, and the reason we don't is because some of the characteristics of folk music are that it's community-based. There are, it springs from a place. It tends to tell a story, whether it's a personal story or a story of a larger community of people. And the problem is once you draw a box around folk music, you've left something out that ought to be in. And what those lines also do is cut it off from the community. Now, I generally challenge people to write a definition of folk music that does not include rap music, because you can't do it. And in fact, we're talking about hip-hop panels, if not for Vancouver, then for Pittsburgh, because how do you think about music that springs from a community that is of the streets, that comes in a guerrilla kind of fashion, not through a mainstream presence, and not include, the street music that's happening now? You can't do it. Now, there are people within my organization who have their own likes and desires about what they want to hear under the folk umbrella, but it's part of our job, and part of the reason we exist is to open the eyes within as well as the eyes without. In terms of, I remember, someone who is very dear to me who came marching out of a showcase in Chicago that featured electric Chicago-based blues band. That's not folk music, And there's a lot of that goes on because people do tend to gravitate toward the genre that they really love, and the minute you plug in, it's like the old apocryphal story about Pete Seeger and Dylan plugging in at Newport, and how, my gosh, it's a sin, but it isn't, So there's a lot of, when you get on the outer edges of that, it gets very fuzzy. There's a whole group of people now who are involved in Folk Alliance here in the U.S. who came together at WOMEX, which is the World Music Industry meeting that last year was in Berlin. And, they're after the Folk Alliance conference in Cleveland, where we did present, artists that they juried in and, you know, had a more of an official presence than they've ever had before. A lot of them feel like Folk Alliance is a natural home for world music here in the States because there's not a Womex equivalent in North America. So they want to see if Folk Alliance will work for them, and that's great. Well, then right after we got back, there was this huge discussion on their listserv about changing the name of Folk Alliance because it's not folk music and dance. We have to folk and world music, or, you know, and then it begs the question, which some people think that folk is a sub-genre of world music, and then the other people think that world is a sub-genre of folk. And I'm not sure what I would say about that, but, you know, for our purposes at this point, world is a subgenre of folk, but you know,
world music is more of an artificial industry construct than folk is. So,
well, it is. I mean, you can point fingers at Ben Mendelsohn for coining the phrase, you know. So it actually is. It's totally an industry-based artificial moniker on that kind of music, you know. And the majority of it, I think, does fit under folk. There's a segment of it that is significant that fits under pop. And which is fine, you know, and so be it. We haven't said. I mean, the Stevens sisters were supposed to come to the conference, and they ended up getting snowed out basically because they had plane trouble or van trouble actually.
Van trouble,
yeah, and then they couldn't get a plane in that they could afford by the time they flew everybody in, and that, you know, that's, I would say they stand at the edge of sort of commercial country. Kind of, which would be the equivalent of a world music artist who stands on the edge of pop. You know, there's still stuff for them at Folk Alliance, and there's still stuff that a Folk Alliance audience would be relating to, but still they have a foot in a different genre of music as well. But the edges are very, very fuzzy.
Sure. It seems that with hip-hop, in a sense, that you are, unless you're very careful, you kind of miss the train on what portion of that is truly folk music, because it's been a major industry force for years now. To start a hip-hop panel now almost seems as if you are...
No, but we're talking about recording the oral history of it.
I see.
I mean, in the sense of looking at it. No, we don't want to say, okay, this is what's happening now in hip-hop, except in the context of this is where it started, this is how it came through, and this is the evolution that it's taken, which is the same kind of thing we would do about bluegrass music.
Now, Mark Moss told me that he thinks you should, 1, have a definition, and 2, have a definition that encompasses everything you encompass right now. Have you ever talked to him about that?
Oh, yeah, and it's real interesting because when he was on the steering committee, he absolutely was no definition.
Right.
He was a no definition person. And I think it is difficult because, you know, someone from the media calls me up and says, well, what's your definition of folk music? It's like, well, we don't do it. And they turn you know, they don't let me get to the next part of the story. A lot of them do, but some of them don't, you know. And if I had a pat definition of what the genre of folk was, you know, maybe I could satisfy that. But that, you know, that kind of panders to this need to put things in boxes. And I think Mark is very right. If we had a definition, it would make his life a lot easier when he went out to talk to media people, and also potentially corporate sponsors that are not industry sponsors. It certainly would make my life easier if I was doing that, if I had a packaged something or other that I could give to people. But I don't think that's what the organization was formed to do. I think we were formed to be different. We are the only genre of music that includes audience as part of the community, you know, bar none. Even, you know, we're probably closest, I would say, in the big bad music world, we're potentially closest to jazz. Or, you know, and I think Folk Alliance, you know, I think we feel that blues belongs with us, but we can also see how blues belongs to jazz, and I think that's our great bridge to jazz in terms of how the music is viewed, how the practitioners of it view it. But even jazz, and for the most part blues, people do not include performers as part of their community. And folk always have.
Audiences as part of their
audience. Yeah, I said performance, I meant audience. And, and that's a big difference for us. So I think the organization was formed to be really different. And even though it makes our job more difficult, I think, I guess I'm still in the let's not try to define it club. The board is still working on the idea of presenting an award show. Yeah, and it's something that Dan Curry spearheaded when he was on the board, and he's still working on. And the difficulty with that is the same kind of thing. I mean, once you start, you list the obvious categories, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that's left off. It's really, really difficult. And the board is really conscious of that, and they're not interested in looking like the Country Music Association Awards, and they're not, with the best left-handed banjo player category and that kind of stuff. They're really conscious of wanting to make this different, and by the time you get into categories, it really is difficult. The first go-around of this, of trying to do an awards thing, ended up, thanks to Jim Rooney, to being developed into the Lifetime Achievement Awards, because it just became really clear to him, the committee he was working with, that it was nearly impossible for our organization to put a stamp on an award show that was inclusive enough.
Right.
And it's difficult.
Now, did Jim, and this is a history I don't know, did Jim sit down with a committee with the idea of working up a genre-based awards presentation?
Pretty much. That's where it started.
Point. Okay.
Yeah, and I can't remember who all was on his committee, although I certainly could find out. And they developed, they talked about it and talked about it and talked about it, and finally figured out that they just couldn't do what they wanted to do with such a program.
Right.
And what they wanted to do was to, honor people who made a difference. At that time especially, which was it was in the early 90s, award shows actually were pretty negative at that point. IBMA had just started an award show program, and in the beginning theirs was a little rough. I remember at a board meeting somebody saying, yeah, it'd be nice if we had a program where you felt honored if you won. Because some of what was coming out about then was pretty tough, and it felt like offhand, and the production values weren't good, and blah blah blah. The production values of our first show weren't good either. We didn't have the LAA videos for the first one when we honored Pete Seeger and Alan Lomax. But with the further development of that, and being able to do the videos and turning it really into more of an event for the community, I think that program really has a value to people that's fairly significant.
Paradoxically, it seems that while those outside the alliance or the community, I'll use that loosely, might find a definition of folk useful, in the context of an award show, the Folk Alliance, for example, could not possibly give an award for Best Traditional Folk Album, because that's meaningless.
Right, exactly. That's the difficulty.
Yeah.
Okay, so which tradition?
We can harp about the Grammys and say, okay, let's work with Traditional Folk Award and make it better. But for you, that's pointless.
Yeah. And it was interesting, because I sat on the Grammy committee this last year, and the first screening part, not the final selection of the final candidates. And the screening effort actually was very. I felt really proud of it. I felt really well done, and then it turns out one of the people who won wasn't one of the people that we had in our categories, because there's always the Grammy Super Committee that reaches down and plunks something in a category. What's his name? I can't think of what it was offhand. It's escaping me. But whoever won for contemporary folk this year, I think, was someone that we didn't deal with in our phase.
That was Tom Waits, wasn't it? There was a controversy.
Yeah, that was it. And someone called me up furious, I was on the committee, said, what the hell were you thinking putting him in there? I said, he didn't come in through our process.
Yeah.
But that whole process was really interesting. Because I think that the people who were there in the room are people who really knew what was going on. But it shows up the difficulty of trying to do that, working in the trad category and working in the contemporary category.
I have at times gotten a sense that one of the reasons the Folk Alliance works for its activists, those who are turning the wheels, is that most of them seem to have, and I know it when I see it, intuitiveness about what is folk that's brought from years gone by, and it's exemplified by the fact that you gave Pete Seeger and Alan Lomax your first Lifetime Achievement Awards. There's a 50s, 60s folk revival consciousness that permeates those who've served in decision-making positions on the board that allows them to know it when they see it. Do you think there's some truth to that?
I think that certainly serves for a lot of people. There are people who, but I think it's not limited to that. I think that there's the whole organization has benefited from that 50s, 60s folk revival. The mentality of it, the activities that went on in it, because it did reach back. It reached. Now it did reach primarily into Anglo-based music, but it did start people thinking about tradition bearers and what that means. I think that the organization has benefited from that, and I think it also has left the more thoughtful. I mean, because there are some people who just want folk to stop there, and that's one of those people. That's one of the characteristics of those people who I find to be in their boxes, and they're really not interested in broadening horizontally or even vertically, from where they are. They want to focus on that time frame. And, people say things to me all the time like, well, there isn't any folk music anymore, is there? It's kind of like, well. So there's a defined time period, I think, that it means it did help people open up and start thinking. And the more thoughtful people from that time frame are ones who are really interested in opening their horizon even further. It got people used to the idea of looking at music, community-based music, I think, for the first time in any kind of systematic way. Going into, the romantic thing was being Mike Seeger and going into the hills and finding the old auto harp player and going out and doing the collecting. The Lomaxes, the Warners, they had done it, but their stuff came to fruition really during that revival. Just like the Harry Smith collection, brought people into, looking at different communities of music. So I think it served the whole field really well. I think the thoughtful people from those eras are the people who are still looking at expansion, and they're expanding the reach and expanding the field. I think by now looking into communities that they might not have thought of before, but ones that they have now recognized are as relevant and as important as the communities that have been previously explored.
Is there a risk that sort of a psychic alliance with that time is going to contribute to a problem that people do talk about, which is that the Folk Alliance skews upward age-wise? Younger people don't remember the 60s,
right.
And a lot of them
get tired of hearing about it.
Shut up about the goddamn 60s. And
well, I think, and I think the real strength of all the contemporary songwriters in the organization actually are preventing the whole organization from being marginalized that way. It's interesting, I think, if you look up the people that were on the steering committee, I think strongly represented that era and that sensibility. But what's interesting is they set up an organization that was open to change. I mean, they weren't locked into that. The organization could easily have become that if they had set it up in such a way to keep it narrow and keep it confined in a box. But they purposefully set up an organization that had enough flex that it could move into contemporary areas. Those people aren't coming to me and saying, oh, world music should go away. They're not coming to me and saying, what do you mean Ani DeFranco is showcasing? They're glad to see the vitality that newer stuff brings. And so I don't think it's I don't think it's constrained by that.
Where do you see? Well, let me backtrack a little bit. I consider myself until this year. Or last year, I'd consider myself a casual observer. I really had no business going to my first Folk Alliance conference, except I read about it and sing out, and I like to do things. And I didn't know I had no business going there, so I went with Randy, and he was saying and we devised the line that I was his roadie. That's how I walked through.
There you go.
But I didn't know that. I went as a formed folk band who'd read sing out for years and always went to shows and what have you, and thought this sounded interesting. But to a casual observer such as myself, and I went to Boston and I stopped for years until I decided that the Folk Alliance was something that bore writing about and being paid to. And it seems to me, from the vantage point of getting your, how often are they, quarterly newsletters or whatever, that much of the work of the organization is put into getting the next conference held. What do you see as the role of the Folk Alliance in the future and beyond staging its own shindig?
Well, our biggest thing is trying to get the tail to quit wagging the dog.
Right. And there's those 5 goals: education, networking, advocacy, field, and professional development.
And it's a constant struggle because we have to, the conference has to go and be a really big success in order to fund the organization's activities. And in 1999 we did a partnership with the Folk Life Center and presented a concert.
The Henry Reed
the Henry Reed show. And then in May we did the Phil Oaks Weekend with the Rock Hall. We're trying, and this summer on June 10th, we're co-sponsoring a Woody Guthrie thing at the Smithsonian with American history. And so we try to do events that are off conference. We've offered our music business basics class off conference, and we're trying to do that again this year as well. To take education to people who can't necessarily get to the conference. We want to educate our members in that way. We would do public education through the events like the Phil Oaks Weekend and like the Woody Guthrie Weekend, educating in particular about those people, because those are all open to the general public, and there's seminars and as well as a concert and that kind of stuff. The Henry Reed one was mostly just the concert as a fundraiser for the fund at the Library of Congress. I think we're trying to expand our suite of services. One thing that I've been trying to get a handle on is how to offer a health program, for people. We've been working on the PRO thing interminably. It's one that's a really the Performing Rights Organizations, agreements with ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC. And and that's one that we've been working with ASCAP for 3 years, and we don't have anything on paper yet for that.
For benefit of my tape recorder, I guess. Why don't you tell me what the issue is?
Well, there are 2 issues, and we're unique in that we try to look at both sides. We look at the presenter side, where we have we're trying to get discounted rates for our member presenting organizations, so that their licensing rates don't put them out of business. And on the other side, we have our songwriters, and the problem is that most folk performance falls below what the performing rights organizations, because they just do sampling, and they do like the top 100 festival and tour performances, or they do like the top 100 tours, and they're talking about like the Rolling Stones, and if we were lucky, they'd hit Lilith Fair, but I don't even think they hit Lilith when Lilith went around, because it wasn't the top 100 grossing. And so those tours mean, and because they do it by sampling, that means that the licensing monies that are collected from folk venues don't go to folk performers, because they're just too low. They're below the horizon of what sampling will pick up. So we're trying to develop schemes whereby the performers can self-report the way they do in Europe and the way they do in Canada, but so can have distributions based on the basic, essentially, set list of performers, so that songwriters get the distributions, and we can, if we have discounted licensing fees from the venue side, then that money circulates within the folk community, and more presenters will be licensed because they can afford it, and more songwriters will get distributions because they'll finally be seen.
songwriters will, in essence, for the most part, be self-reporting the performance of their own songs. Is that how that's how that would work? Right?
They will self-report their gig list, which will have their songs, but it'll have their friends' songs. It'll have these other songs.
Yeah, to a degree. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
So that's the main thing, and we're furthest along with ASCAP, who in principle have agreed with us on how to do this, but we still have a few things we're still trying to iron out. But that effort has really already paid off, and because ASCAP, when you say, well, it's the Uptown Coffee House series, and they say, oh, coffee house, ooh, restaurant, your licensing fees are $450 a quarter, and it's like, it took 2 years for us to get them to figure out that coffee house isn't a restaurant, so it's because they don't run in our world, When they see coffee, they think restaurant. They think Starbucks. They think, all that kind of stuff. So it's like, what do you mean? This is a restaurant. This is a bar. You're making money off. It's like, no. So that took 2 years, and I field a lot of calls from people that are about that. They go, I just got this thing for BMI, and they want to charge me $4,000. And it's like, okay, what schedule do they have you on? Well, it's this restaurant and bar owners. It's like, well, first of all, tell them you're not a restaurant. Don't panic. But we're still trying to get that stuff nailed down, and we don't have it nailed down yet. So that's the kind of thing that builds strength in the organization. We have 47 small organizations, small and medium-sized organizations that are nonprofit because of our group exemption program. So we offer an umbrella group exemption. They apply to us, and they get listed as part of our group with the IRS.
Okay.
And so they don't have to go in and file individual paperwork to become nonprofit. So that's 47 organizations that have all the benefits of being a nonprofit association, through us. So there is other stuff that we do, and we're trying to do more of the other stuff. As Janet's taken on conference management, she's been in the position to take a lot of that stuff off of me. So now I'm working on more of these other things.
And when those negotiations take place with ASCAP and BMI, is it essentially you?
Yeah.
You're the.
Yeah.
Okay. What is the staff here? I guess I know there's just 3 of you, correct?
4.
4 of you. Okay.
Yeah. So there's me. I'm the executive director. Margaret Loomis is the administrative director. Tony Zisselberger, who's out here, he's the jack of all trades. We call him in charge of programs and services, but it means he does whatever he needs to do. And then Janet Braun is conference manager.
Okay.
I'm going to get some coffee. You want some more?
Yeah, I would like some. You mentioned a few minutes ago that someone, and I forget who, suggested dropping the word folk, and you said you'd lose your defining, I forget how you put it, but you'd lose your defining principle. But it's interesting there, when I interviewed Sandy Payton, Sandy was disgusted that the Folk Alliance has nothing to do with folk as he sees it.
Right.
And I think it's an overly harsh assessment, but Sandy's 71 years old and has been doing it for many years.
Sandy, right. And and it's like, I don't see how he could look at what we presented in Cleveland.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I said to myself, now, there was, I felt personally, and from people I talked to, and I tried to hit this question with lots of people around. I don't know, it wasn't formal interviews, but people really felt that Cleveland was a huge improvement over Albuquerque in terms of at least the visibility. If not, some would say, oh, it was all there in Albuquerque, but at least the visibility of trad music was greater. And I thought to myself that Sandy is very hung up on the fact that the Folk Alliance involves a lot that he doesn't think of as folk, and so you dilute the word. Whereas if you called yourself the North American Alliance for Independent Music, Sandy would come to a conference and say, my God, finally a music industry conference that deals with so much traditional music.
No, it's tough, and that's what we run into. And, a lot of people left after Boston. I mean, a lot of people who came to Cleveland came after a lot of personal lobbying to their first conference in a long time. I mean, the Boston conference was deaf by singer-songwriter. That's the only way to describe it. Part of it is because that was the predominant thing that was going on in Boston at the time. Although I saw some of the best traditional music that I've ever seen with people like Frank Farrell and a whole bunch of fiddlers from the East Coast doing traditional Irish and a lot of Celtic music and stuff from the Maritimes. You know, that was at Boston, but there was me and what's his name, Regis, what's his name, from the Celtic trader down in North Carolina, and, you know, maybe 4 other people in the room. Everybody else was recovering from death by singer-songwriter. And I get really frustrated, you know, especially the people involved in Albuquerque, you know, people who criticize Albuquerque for not having traditional music, because there was a ton of it there. It wasn't Anglo-based. You know, it was New Mexican traditional players. We had at least one workshop every session, plus we did the traditional music of Mexico, plus we did traditional Swedish fiddle. We did a ton of trad music, but you know what? It wasn't Appalachian music, and so therefore it wasn't traditional. And that annoys me to hell, because I think that's really, I think people really have to take responsibility for what they're talking about. And if they tell me that there was no traditional music there, then it's sort of like, well, you know, then it's like, oh, so for you traditional is only old time and Appalachian music, period.
60s folk revival, I'm sorry, but that's
no, I know, but it's
controlling
right,
a lot of mindsets.
It is, and I think, you know, and Sandy's a perfect example of all that, and I love him to death. But, you know, it's interesting because there's a lot of people who fall into that, and some of those people found a home in the Old Time Music on the Radio conference. But that group is trying to figure out how to have a larger impact and a larger impression outside their own little community, because what they have found is that they're talking to fewer and fewer people every year. You know, the OTR conference happens every other year. This year, actually, had to be canceled because there wasn't funding from the North Carolina Arts Council, so it's going to be happening next year. But it's an ever-decreasing pool of people. The meeting gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Why? Because people are just tired of talking to themselves. You know, the only place for growth, and where, as you alluded to earlier, you know, what's the future of the organization? The future of the organization is crossing those bounds. I mean, the picture on the cover of the newsletter this time, you know, with Mamadou Diabetti jamming with the Volo Bog Trotters and Michael Miles and having an old-time clog dancer dancing in the middle of that group. I mean, to me, ultimately, that is why the folk alliance will continue to prosper. And it's not that you have to be there for that. You know, if you just wanted to hear the old-time music, you know, you would have gone to the trad music singing on Saturday night. You would have gone to the old-time music thing where we had Kenny Seidel and Les Raber and, you know, those people on Friday night. And you wouldn't have been in the hallway at 3 o'clock in the morning to see that happen. And that's fine, but to protect what you like, you have to understand that there is value in the synergy of coming together and having genres of music bridge across to each other. And that's the only way the organization is going to survive.
Why do people not come? And I don't mean the Sandys. I know why Sandy doesn't come anymore, because the term folk has been hijacked.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a whole lot of other people who don't come, and they're not out of Anglo traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And the Folk Alliance seems to have a problem reaching out to true ethnic-based community arts organizations, except to the extent that they might be brought in for a look, because they're tied to the conference by their locality, such as the Cleveland had a lot of local ethnic East European music. But as members, as activists, I don't see. I can make up some names. The Caribbean Arts Foundation.
Right.
You know, I don't see those folks coming to the Folk Alliance. Do you have?
They don't see any need for the Folk Alliance, because their perception is the Folk Alliance is a bunch of, you know, white people from the 60s.
Okay.
You know, I mean, that's what they think it is.
Right.
And so it's a matter of, you know, the World Music Group is sort of one entry, and the special effort we made in Cleveland into some of the Eastern European communities is another entry. And I think it's just a long-term development issue for the organization as a whole. It's hard to it's interesting, Jim, at Old Town School, they have a community coordinator, community outreach coordinator. And that's, it took years for that program to really start to show some fruit. And one thing that they found in Chicago was that even the F word was a big stopper.
Jim told me that they did a survey among the African American audience and they hated the word folk.
Absolutely. And that is not inconsequential when it comes to diversifying the organization, both its membership and its programming. We're doing better with the programming because we can be invitational with some of that. But in terms of, having the membership of the organization itself start to diversify, it's a long-term development thing, and there's lots of challenges there. I mean, it's basically been on individual invitational bases that we have gotten more people to come. And but it still is a predominantly white-based organization. Now, community organizations, part of the issue is that music plays different roles in different communities. The 60s revival period era, that kind of thing of Folk Alliance, folk music changed there into a performance phenomenon, as opposed to a sitting on the front porch phenomenon, as opposed to a community gathering presentation phenomenon.
Do you think it changed, or do you think something new was created?
I think
what was created was taking music that was always performed,
something new was created, and as you say, some of those people are instrumental in starting the organization, so the organization started there. And it's been difficult to reach back into the community bases of some of the seminal musics that are now part of what people are broadening their definition of folk to include. But those organizations have been going along just fine, thank you.
Right.
And they have, the artists are not people who want to tour. They're members of the community. They want to stay in the community. They want to play for their community members in the context of their community. Why should they come to Folk Alliance? Why bring it up? And that's where the organization, I think there's intersection and education that can happen. But if you talk to people like Ethel Rain in New York and some people who work in these different ethnic communities, it's a long development effort to get them to tell their story to the rest of New York City. What is the incentive for them to tell their story to a broader audience, unless we happen to be there that year? The Tamburitzans and even the groups that came to Folk Alliance, I'd say the junior Tamburitzans, the little kids who were there, and then the Tamburitzan group that was on the showcase on Saturday night or Friday night. Those two groups, I think, are Cleveland-based and going to stay in Cleveland. Some of the polka bands that were local committee selections for the conference showcase are locally based and going to stay there. But certainly, Harmonia and Spheri, their members came from the local community, either Pittsburgh or Cleveland, and they come out of the community basis for their music, but they are groups that were interested in going out and touring.
Right.
And getting gigs elsewhere. Sorry.
That's all right.
I think it all dried out.
I guess there's a real quandary then. I mean, you are, at bottom, you're a professional development organization, it seems.
Yep.
And for people who are not interested in professional development, people who sing because they want to sing in a community-based setting, they have no need for any professional development organization.
That's right.
Whether it's called folk or called something else.
Or anything else. And they would say, no, I don't play folk music. I just play, I played Balkan music and,
that's the historic quandary, which is that the folk don't call themselves folk. And,
right.
And the American Folklore Association is debating changing their name. They're not going to, but it's going on. But
it is true, and it actually carries over into, the Anglo-based traditions. What does the North Carolina porch picker want with Folk Alliance?
Right.
I think everybody gets a kick if their music is featured. And I think everybody really enjoys it if they have a chance to come and tell their story. I'd take that back. Maybe not even everybody wants that.
Right.
I think a lot of people do want that. And I think that people can be, through personal relationships, convinced to come and tell a little bit of their background and their history and share a little bit of music. The context of it gets very challenging. If you have a community-based music, well, even in Tucson, you know, when the Wyla musicians were up there, I don't know if you even noticed or remember Jim Griffith.
Oh yeah, I
You
remember
know,
him. I remember him
walking
saying
up and down the aisle. What's the matter with you people? You should be dancing. This is social dance music. You're insulting these musicians.
Well, Jim also prefaced his introduction, I remember this very well, by saying you are about to participate in an unnatural act.
Right.
Do you recall those words? And he was right, of course.
And he was furious when people weren't going. I mean, some people danced, not a whole lot of people did.
They're in an auditorium.
Right.
It's the wrong context.
No, I mean, there was a whole dance floor up front.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, so that's the kind of stuff you run into. My first time seeing chicken scratch music was on the reservation. Angela took me out to see a band play. Several of us out. Ken was one of them. He was on the board at the time. And we went out into this little, you know, sort of covered space on the reservation, and it was at night. There wasn't, I guess there must have been electricity, but there were all these fires and barrels around, and they were playing for a tribal dance, and everybody was dancing, young people, old people, it was all part of the event. And seeing the music in that context meant that the next time I saw it in the auditorium kind of atmosphere, I knew what was expected.
Right.
If I'd have been seeing the auditorium music first, I wouldn't have known what was expected.
Sure.
So is what maybe, and we talked about this actually for Cleveland, was trying to find a community-based event that we could invite conference people to.
Right.
And ultimately, it turned out to be a bad weekend for it because it was around Valentine's Day, and there were some other things that came up around that. But we really thought long and hard about it. And we talked